live. Time Out of Mind I'm reading, and it's been fascinating, I believe, for me anyway. This is the life of Joan Grant. It's an autobiography. She was a far memory writer, and she had lots of requests by people asking her how she became so amazing at writing. She wrote Winged Pharaoh when she was in her 20s, and she wrote Life as Carola as the second book. I've read 4 of her books, As Moses Was Born, which was playing at the time before the flood, so a long time ago. Anyway, she explains it really well. The last chapter finished with her already knowing, because she has this knowing and she can hear spirit, and she heard Jenny, her grandma, telling her that she will never see Esmond again. And thankfully she was able to spend the night with him. She has a way of explaining this far sight better than anybody I have ever heard. So we are now at chapter 9. Tomorrow Never Comes. Esmond was in Paris and I was in England. This inescapable fact was so far more important than anything else that I would have preferred to be left alone, to think about him undisturbed, while the empty days, empty except for the arrival of the postman, crawled by as inconspicuously as possible. However, the ivory tower was out of bounds. Esmond, who had no patience with drapes, frequently reminded me in his letters that a knight-errant expects his lady love to produce a fair quota of rivals for him to vanquish in the lists. So why was I not going to dances? Was I afraid that if I saw Douglas or Leslie or any of the others, I would find my love for him did not survive the test of competition? As both my parents were inordinately possessive, this viewpoint was refreshing and yet very odd. I even asked Mother what she thought about it. "A most sensible young man," she said warmly. "He knows that when 2 men are in love with you, 4 men are in love with you, but if only 1 man loves you, no man really loves you at all." So having told them that I was in love with Esmond and would marry him the moment I got the chance, I went to dances with other escorts and very nearly managed to enjoy myself, which made it much easier to write gay, amusing letters to Paris. I tried to make myself believe, and almost succeeded, that I had only imagined the voice which had told me I was never going to see him again. Imagined it so that it could shout down the voice of conscience, which had been trying to speak louder than my heart. But although I tried to be reasonable, I fretted and slept badly, and so lost weight as I always did when unhappy. The removal of tonsils was the fashionable cure-all that year, so Mother decided this had better be performed on me. I managed to stall until I had been one of the 8 bridesmaids at Diana's wedding to her cousin Stan in March. Then they sailed off for honeymoon in India, where his father and his uncle, Sir Stanley Jackson, was governor of Bengal, and I was put into a nursing home. I think Mother must have chosen it because it was the only one of the several she inspected which had no visiting hours. She had no intention of being kept from her child's bedside by nonsensical rules backed by an officious matron. She had, of course, no idea that it was almost certainly the one immortalized in Evelyn Waugh's vile bodies where the patient dies unnoticed during a cocktail party in his room. The surgeon must have been affected by the slap-happy atmosphere, for halfway through the operation he found he had forgotten to bring some essential bit of equipment and had to send a taxi to his home in Harley Street to fetch it. They were the largest and healthiest tonsils he had ever removed, and to prove it, they were put into a glass jar by my bed. The matron's Dalmatian eyes seemed longingly, and even occasionally so far forgot discretion as to sit up and beg, no doubt recognizing them as part of his perks. 3 days later, exhausted by a stream of visitors, I was sitting up in bed, having a dry shampoo, while a manicurist, also part of the nursing home service, was doing my nails, when a fountain of blood gushed out of my mouth. 6 hours and 4 doctors later, the hemorrhage stopped. I was by that time full of morphia and had been packed in ice. The ice, wrapped only in face towels, melted and left me unconscious in a freezing lake. Rather naively, everyone was astonished when my temperature shot up and I developed pneumonia. Pneumonia, when every time you cough your throat threatens to bleed again. It's very little fun. But as soon as I had weathered the crisis, Douglas came to visit me every day during his lunch hour, and Leslie was even more helpful as he cajoled the Scottish night nurse to let him stay in my room when I was too tired to sleep, and my head ached so much I could not read. I know it's against the rules to have visitors after midnight, said kind Sister Cameron, but Mr. Grant has such beautiful brown eyes that him sitting quietly on the floor holding your hand cannot possibly do you anything but good. How right she was. I'm sure more people die in hospitals from loneliness and boredom than from mere clinical symptoms. I had not told Esmond that I was in a nursing home. The kind of wife I intended to become must always be gay and romantic, and above all, healthy. There was nothing romantic about having a tonsillectomy. It sounded nearly as squalid as adenoids, so my letters about the future we should share adventuring around the world made no mention of the present. But what are you going to do with yourself now, darling? Do stop being evasive, he wrote. So I answered, explaining what had really been happening. His reply was immediate and more than reassuring, in the form of a long, intimate telegram which told me he was flying over to see me the following evening. I seized the telephone and rang Mother, who agreed that I could come back at once to the flat in Charles Street, which had been lent to them by Tom Scully, who was in America, instead of staying in the nursing home another 2 days. It was a large flat, and I walked up and down the passages so as to teach my legs not to feel wobbly. I washed my hair, I arranged flowers. At last everything was ready for Esmond, who would find me well and radiant instead of lying in a nursing home bed, with the smell of ether lingering in the corridors and the clink of bedpans echoing from the sluice next door. I was too excited to sleep, so Mother gave me a sleeping pill, which I accepted gratefully, as I was determined not to look old and haggard for Esmond. It was dark, deep sleep, unbroken by the shadow of a dream. The front doorbell woke me. I heard the maid cross the hall and then her telling Father, "It's a telegram for you, sir." I heard him say, "It's from Esmond's mother." I shot out of bed shouting, "It's for me, it's he coming to meet him at Croydon. She coming to meet him at Croydon. Go to bed. Go back to bed, child. You'll catch a cold," Mother said quickly, and then followed Father into the sitting room. Suddenly I was frightened and sat on the edge of the bed, telling myself that even if Esmond could not come over from Paris today, I mustn't let them see how much I minded. Father came into the room, shut the door carefully, and stared out of the window. "I'm afraid I've got very bad news for you, Oldching," he said, without looking at me. "We've had a telegram. Esmond is dead." "He can't be dead. I would know if he was dead. He's coming. Here, today." But even while I frantically protested, I knew that it was true. Tears pouring out of my eyes, Father sat beside me on the bed, patting me on the back, in an agony of pity and embarrassment. Poor dear man, he had not seen me cry since I was 4, and even then I had enough self-control to cry decently into a medicine bottle. Now I had no defense against the tide of overwhelming grief. "Thank God, oh thank you, God," I sobbed, "for letting me sleep with Esmond before he died." Father covered me with an eiderdown and went out of the room. I felt guilty for having upset him by crying in public, but perhaps he knew how much it helped to have his shoulder to cry on. Mother came in. "Poor child, I feel very sorry for you," she said briskly. "But how could you be such a fool as to tell Jack that Esmond had seduced you under your father's roof? If you are pregnant, own up at once, and I will take you to Paris to get rid of it." In a passion of fury, I said many things which it took a long time to forgive. I drove her out of the room. I threw on some clothes and fled from the house. And walked forever. Oh, this is so moving. Along the lonely London houses. During some of the time I must have been in Hyde Park, for I remember lying face downwards on harsh, gritty grass. Well, I've got to get through this. That smelled of sheep. But except for this, there was a cold grey hold in my memory of that day from 10 o'clock in the morning when I ran out of the flat until 8 that evening when I found myself standing outside an open door in Hertford Street. Why did the door mean something? Who lived there? Leslie lived there. But there would be a row if Mother found out I had been alone to a man's room. But it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered anymore. I was so tired that I could only climb the stairs by clinging to the banisters. Leslie was sitting alone by the empty fireplace. Esmond is dead, I said flatly. Oh, damn. How damningly unfair. Now he's dead, you will always love him instead of loving me. I began to shiver. My teeth chattered so much I couldn't speak. There was a bath in his bedroom, with a geyser above it on the wall. He turned it on until the room was full of steam. Then he picked me up and dressed me like a very kind and competent nanny, and put me into the bath, trickled kind hot water over my shoulders with his enormous sponge. Then he wrapped me in his woolen dressing gown and put me in an armchair with a rug over my knees. He gave me tea with a lot of sugar in it and 2 boiled eggs, which he cooked on a gas ring. Now you can talk, he said. Talk until you've talked yourself out. And if you want to cry, then cry. It would be far the most sensible thing you could possibly do. I don't want to cry anymore. I cried out, Father, and I don't expect he will ever want to see me again. Don't talk nonsense, darling. Neither of them want to see me again, and I don't want to see them. I've had the most terrible row with Mother. I told her that she was a murderess when she said she would take me to Paris to have an abortion. Of course you mustn't have an abortion, he said hotly. You will marry me at once and pretend it's mine. But I'm not going to have a baby, I confessed miserably. That's almost the cruelest part of everything. If I had been an efficient adulteress, they would have had to let us be married 3 months ago, and then Esmond wouldn't be dead. Or why is he dead? Is he safe? Mother said he must have committed suicide. That was when I really lost my temper. The telegram said, please break news gently to Joan before she sees it in the newspapers that Esmond's had a fatal accident. Mother said, fatal accident always means suicide. But he wouldn't have killed himself. That was one of the things we agreed are utterly not done. Of course he didn't kill himself. Don't be such an ass, said Leslie decisively. He was probably run over by one of those ghastly French taxis. Are you sure? I'm sure really not about the taxi, but it's so difficult to be sure when people like Mother put ideas into your head. I will go to Paris tomorrow and find out exactly what happened. I won't spare you the details because you're not the kind of person who can be confronted by half-truths. What do you want to do for the next few days? They're going to be absolute hell for you, and it's no use telling you now that it will hurt less after a time, but it will. I can't go back to Seacourt. I couldn't bear it. Where then? The least awful thing about would be to go somewhere I'd never been to before, quite alone, in my car. But my car is unhailing. I can easily fix that. Someone will fetch it first thing in the morning. But you can't go off alone, damn it. You've been in bed for 5 weeks and ought to be in bed now. Wait a moment while I go and telephone. He came back to announce that he had persuaded Mrs. Workman to let Kirstine go with me for a fortnight's motor tour. Kirstine is collecting some clothes for you from Seacourt now. Tommy will drive her up in your car tomorrow and meet us here at 12. Oh, thank you. Can I please stay with you until Kirstine comes? He hesitated. I'd give anything to keep you here, but it would only cause more trouble with your parents. So I will take you back to Charles Street, and you can stay in the taxi while I'll explain firmly, very firmly to them both, that it is very lucky that you didn't faint in the street and get run over by a bus, and that they are not to attempt to see you, just to make sure you are left alone. I shall spend the night outside your door. And he did, bless him. I think both father and mother were relieved that he had taken from their shoulders the burden of their unhappy and difficult child. Well, apologize for the emotions, but there it is.